Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Stag. Today, on this podcast, we're going to talk about media and politics. Today, we have
Juliana Gentili.
Dylan Hamer at your service.
Brendan Kilroy.
So, we're going to have Dylan go up first and talk about.
I'm going to be discussing several media biases we see in American politics today. And the first thing I'd like to talk about is the effect that the media biases have. They have led to a lower quality of information from the media. They've created more polarization, making it more difficult to actually do politics. And they have increased the amount of negative politics and hostility we see towards the media. And I would offer up a solution to focus more on facts and data journalism, as opposed to focusing on these different biases. So the first thing I'll discuss is the lower quality of information we see from the biases. And the main bias that contributes to this would be an economic bias. Every media outlet is obviously looking to make money, and they're trying to make their, information more interesting than other information. And this is called demand side bias. And there are positives and negatives to this, but I would say mainly there are mostly negatives. When they're fighting for viewers, they focus on more interesting stories as opposed to stories with information and facts, which leads to more entertainment and less actual news. Another thing that leads to lower quality of information are the 4 subtopics of media bias. These include personalization, fragmentation, dramatization, and authority disorder bias. And now each one of these plays a role in lowering the quality of information. For example, personalization bias will focus on a single person, like how an event affects a single person, as opposed to its overall effects on the public or how the policy affects everyone in the country. They just focus on one person. And that's just one of the 4 subtopics. Obviously, each one of them plays into the lowering of the information. There's also a problem with misinformation within the media, and this has to do with economic bias because, there's people in the media are trying to get their stories out quicker than everyone else, because they want them to be the first ones out there. And this can lead to misinformation because they're not always completely checking the stories to make sure they're true before they put them out there. And once people hear it, it's kind of hard to get it out of their head, and it's just gonna kind of be the way they think. There is, however, a bit of a political bias, though, within the media. Obviously, there are certain outlets that are going to push Republican, and there's certain outlets that are going to push Democrat. And these kind of media outlets really push far to the left or far to the right, and they kind of create more polarization within the public. Like when they have someone like a congressman on their show, for example, they're going to be, the most politically partisan congressman they can get, because that's what makes their viewership happy. And there's selective exposure goes into this, where people are only watching the news that backs up their political beliefs, which also contributes to this continued polarization. And yeah, it's really hard to change people's minds now once they are set on one political belief, because they can just go and watch that outlet that will back up that belief. This leads to a lot of distrust from the public to the media. People trust their local news more, and so a solution to all of this could be data journalism, which is a more fact and data-driven journalism. This could help kind of take out people's biases and just make it more fact-centered. Yeah, that's all I have to say about media bias.
All right. Well, that's good. We're going to take a break, and then we're going to have some questions on media bias.
If you've ever been doing work while you're wicked tired, or you ever needed a hot drink in the morning, think no longer. Go to Dunkin' Donuts and you will get a great coffee today.
All right, welcome back to the podcast. We're now gonna give Dylan some questions, and I got the first one. So, how do you think, or how rampant is the media bias in today's political climate?
So I would say that it is incredibly rampant. I would say that you would be hard pressed to find a media outlet that does not show some kind of bias, whether it be an economic bias or political bias or anything like that, a combination of the two. There always seems to be something that is driving the type of news that they are putting out.
Oh, okay.
That was very interesting. I was curious about what you think the most prevalent and influential media bias is today.
So I would say right now it's the demand side or the economic bias, because obviously, the main goal of starting any kind of business, even if it is in the media, is to make money. And so media outlets are going to try to put out the information that is the most interesting and that is going to make them the most money at the end of the day.
That's funny. Yeah.
Now I got a question for you, Dylan. How prevalent do you think selective exposure is in affecting individual viewership on the media?
So I think selective exposure is huge. I think that it happens incredibly rarely that someone who disagrees with the political views that are being shown is going to watch or read that from that outlet. And I also think it creates a situation where people who are not involved politically are not going to watch the news as much because they don't want to hear, all the political views and, stuff like that.
So do you feel like you felt, or you too are playing into the bias?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, by by only going to the one outlet that's going to agree with you, you're playing into the bias, and you're creating a public that is not going to be very politically intelligent because they're only going to hear what they want to hear.
And do you think sort of politics, but the idea that if it bleeds, it leads, that's big bias too?
Of course. Violence, sex, all that good stuff is gonna play into the information they put out there, because that's what the people want to see: disasters, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting, because I think one of the common themes that you keep bringing up is how the people in the public drive the media bias. So what do you think are some steps that should be taken by the public or in general to try to combat the media bias?
And this is really tough, but I think people would really have to be more focused on the information when they're watching the news, as opposed to entertainment, which they can get from TV shows and stuff like that. But if they want to watch the news, it should be because they want to know facts and they want to be driven by the information, so that they know what's going on in our government and they know what's going on in our country.
But you also see, say, state news fall ill to if it bleeds, it leads.
Sure.
Especially here in Connecticut, the news outlet WFSB always has 5 fires going on. It sounds like it's the end of the world. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And crime's so rampant, you're going to lose your house, you're going to lose everything you have.
Yep.
Do you think this is negative?
I do. And what you were just talking about is a perfect example of what I talked about earlier, the dramatization bias, where, they just make something seem so much worse than it actually is. And it just creates kind of a state of public panic that, might make them money, but at the end of the day is not really beneficial for the people.
Not really beneficial. Huh. So we're kind of responsible for this then.
It goes both ways.
Yeah, it's our interestingly sick entertainment.
Yeah.
That we love. It's weird. It's weird.
It is weird.
But
it's the way it is now, though.
Yeah.
I got one more question.
No, you go ahead.
I got another question for you, Dylan. So you talked a lot about polarization having an effect upon the media.
Sure.
With things such as like censorship and all of that, do you think that has an effect on what the media posts based on like if it's a liberal or more liberal news site posting something that would affect a more liberal candidate?
So I think, like I said before, these outlets, the ones that are more liberal, say, they're gonna push for more liberal candidates, because their viewership is gonna be very, very liberal, very to the left, and they are gonna want to see things that back up their view, like I said, with the selective exposure. So it leads back to, the economics of the site or of the outlet. They need to make money. They know what their viewership wants to see, and they're going to put it out there.
Very good. All right, we're going to take another break. You ever feel hungry studying? Well, don't worry any longer, because now we have the Stag pizza. Get over 100 toppings on any size pizza, only $9.99. All right, welcome back again. Now we're gonna pass it off to Brendan. And
today I'm going to be talking about the relationship between the media and the national government, and how they're codependent and irreplaceable to each other in our current political landscape. And although it isn't always a positive relationship, government and media are necessarily beneficial in the process of sharing and distributing information through levels of coverage in the media, and its relationship through the government with censorship, prior restraint, accountability, elections, and all that. And for I would say the two negative parts of the relationship go in the cases of censorship and prior restraint through things such as the Pentagon Papers, with Edward Snowden, all that stuff, because they really show the media struggling to grasp information from the government, and it kind of looks like government's hiding information in some aspects, and that's how it's been seen through the public perception of these instances, especially in the case of Snowden, where he was framed kind of as a traitor, but a lot of the public saw him as someone who was just trying to spread government spying and stuff like that, where all he was trying to do was show information of what was going on within our government. And I feel like the media is needed for those kind of things, because it basically just shows what's going on with our government, and it improves on the transparency so that people have more faith in what the government's doing. And we're currently in a time where the Congress, government, all of them have very low approval ratings from the people, and the media being more transparent is essential to improve our democracy. And then I think the media is really, really helpful in improving our relationship, or creating a symbiotic relationship between the president and Congress and the media, because the president is needed by the media to spread their message, their information, what they want to show, especially through their honeymoon period, first 100 days, and basically their duration of presidency. They need help to get reelected and all that. And the media gets all of its dramatized information, like you were saying, from the president, especially now in our current landscape with our current president, who has one of the most fractured relationships, I would say, with the media. And I feel like it just allows the public to get more information, especially from the president, Congress. And although the judicial branch is the most appreciated branch, it's the least media focused. And next, I want to talk about elections in the media, with the media in the government. Elections in the government and media. So the media does their job. They have, as you said, there's the liberal media and there's a conservative media, Dylan, and they have their certain cases that they want to help get their candidate elected. They want to help their candidate get promoted in the political landscape. And so you'll see all these bases, just like you'll see these conservative bases saying, we want President Trump to be our candidate in 2020. You'll see the liberal website saying, we want Elizabeth Warren, we want Biden. And it's really important for that, because it allows the public to get the message from the media about candidacy, what's going on in our current landscape, what's going on in our current environment, and all these important information that helps provide like areas of expertise, like what's going on in our current landscape. And then we also have things such as accountability. If someone, like the media and president, this is the most seen in our current environment, especially with the digital media age being more introduced. You'll see if a president says something. And a case of this was when in an official government or White House transcript, we saw the president's we saw the transcript change one of his words from "you never think" to "you never think." It's so dangerous, especially in our current political landscape, where we have the highest office of our land manipulating a transcript that is seen by everyone, that is like that will be seen by the entire environment of people, and it's just so dangerous for a time like this. But I think that even with these things going on in our current environment, it's needed for our media and government to be able to coexist, because it allows our information to be spread to all the people, especially if they're not in like the most popularized areas. But it's just essential for us to be able to share information with one another to create a better United States.
Oh wow, yeah, no, that was good. So we're gonna just take a break and go back and question.
Are you one of those people who are always going to get your phone fixed over and over again? Well, don't worry about that anymore with OtterBox phone cases. Come in now, buy one for $35 and get one free.
So we're back. Now we're gonna ask some questions to Brendan, and my first question to you is: do you think that our judicial system should be more transparent in that we should, like Congress, have a camera in there showing what's going on?
Usually, I would say yes, but the judicial system is a different circumstance in my eyes, primarily because the Supreme Court, especially, is the one court of our land that can never be taken away. It's rooted into our system, and it's necessary for our country. And I think, honestly, that cameras would affect how the justices do their job, and that it would honestly be smarter to keep cameras away, because we've seen in the Senate, it's more, with the cameras being placed on these elected officials, it's more of them just playing to the cameras instead of actually focusing on the important information. So although transparency is essential for our democracy, in this circumstance, I wouldn't honestly put cameras.
You would. And do you think that the Senate too, or the Congress in general, if they didn't have cameras, they would be more efficient?
For the Senate, yeah, I honestly think it would be more efficient, because right now they're just playing to the cameras. And if you eliminated the cameras, I feel like more would get done, because they wouldn't be seeing this as playing to the public eye. It would be more of actually doing my job and representing my people without having to put on a certain angle for the media to use.
And also too, I would also think that if you had cameras in the court, some judges won't be able to say certain things that if the camera wasn't there, he would say, or she. And I also think that you're right in a sense that though it would be somewhat transparent, it wouldn't be accurate. You know, you could probably learn from it, learn about the courts more, but it wouldn't be raw.
Yeah, it would be basically just a pre-edited transcript of what they're actually thinking. They would just have to cover up certain emotions when they're speaking. Like they couldn't be as emotional. They couldn't be as direct. They would have to wind up their statements differently due to like the heavy media effect.
And also negatively affect the case that they're trying, that person. You know what I mean? And it could potentially hurt somebody's life.
Yeah, it's if the courts aren't able to do their job right, if the courts aren't able to do their job how they need to do it, then it will completely affect our democracy, because the most important court of our nation wouldn't be able to run correctly, and that is very dangerous.
Function properly, yeah.
So what I think is interesting, one of the things that you mentioned is how, this debate of whether there should be broadcasting allowed in the courtroom is also something that's present in Congress and how they're playing to the cameras. Do you think that the removal of the media in Congress, or less like presence of the media in Congress, would be an overall positive or negative thing?
I feel like media in itself is essential, especially with like having a free press. Like all of that is necessary for our democracy because we need to be able to cover all of the different situations. But within the Senate floor, I just feel like it's hurt the overall people more than it's helped. So with that, it's still being seen. But overall in Congress, I feel like it's very necessary to have a heavy media application to how we govern because it allows for overall coverage of different situations. Yet, even though partisanship is going on in the media, there's still different sites that will just stick straight to the facts of what happened and just go overall what happened in these cases. But I feel like the media is necessary.
Do you think the presence of term limits with Congress versus not having term limits in the judicial branch affect the need for media presence?
Uh, I would say yes, because there's situations where people will run for re-election, so they will have to play to the media to broadcast what they're going to do and how like amazing they're doing of a job because they need that for the re-election. But with media, it's necessary to have. So even with term limits being an issue, it's just still necessary for the media to be there, just to best apply to the country and give information to people.
And one of the things that you mentioned earlier, you talked about the relationship between the executive branch, specifically with President Trump, and the media. Do you think that overall this is a positive relationship and that the transparency provided is authentic, or do you think that there's manipulation, whether from the media side of things or from President Trump himself?
Oh, there's definitely manipulation, and it's apparent in a lot of situations, but I do think that there is generally a more positive than negative relationship between the executive, legislative branch, all of that, and the media, because it allows for them to coexist with the public, to show what's going on, because there always will be cases, no matter what situation. Like even before media, you had things such as the Sedition Acts, trying to like prevent information from being spread, or like through like what Abraham Lincoln and going to the presses. You'll always have those kind of things, but I feel like the media is allowing us to truly have a relationship with our government and for information to be spread.
Okay. Yeah. Super interesting stuff there, Brendan. My question is, you talked a lot about the media's role in government transparency. As journalists, a lot of journalists take on this watchdog role, within their job. Do you think that they've been doing a good job of keeping government in check, or do you think that they're lacking in that area?
I do think they've been doing a good job because even as we're seeing now, there's all these different stories coming out about what, in specific to President Trump, what he's doing with like Ukraine, what happened with Russia, and all these different situations. Like the media has been doing a good job showing the entire population what's going on, and it's necessary for the people to know what's going on with their president and what's going on with their Congress. So I feel like, yes, it's necessary and it's been a good job.
All right. Well, that's good. We're going to take another break and start another topic when we get back.
Hi, my name's Juliana, and I'm a college student. During this stressful time of finals, I find myself seeking companionship. Go to www.findafriend.com to have a great conversation to ease your mind today.
All right, we're back, and we're moving on to another topic. We have
Juliana here, and I'm going to talk to you guys about media and transparency. And I'm really glad that we actually just started the discussion off with Brendan. I think it's a great segue into some of the things that I'm going to talk about. But one of the main sources of inspiration for me when looking at media and transparency is actually going back to the beginning of America and the founding of the nation. And when we look at the founding of America, there's always been this kind of deep sense and fear of tyranny. And from this fear, some of the central ideas that make up the identity of America, like self-rule and limited government, were born. And very important to these two ideals is the presence of the media in our nation. And the media has come to act as a sort of fourth branch, especially in today's current conditions. Specifically, one interesting quote that from Thomas Jefferson, which he said a few years prior to the ratification of the Bill of Rights, is, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. And I think it's very important to recognize the important role of the media, especially when considering accountability and accessibility and transparency within the government system today. One of the first things I'd like to talk about is how this lack of transparency is something that existed when the Constitution was written. When the Constitution was written, which is obviously objectively one of the most important documents for our nation, it was discussed and debated through conventions of secrecy. And these secrecy rules that were present while the Constitution was being written kind of plays into the discussion about transparency in the government today. And James Madison, who kind of spoke about the need for this secrecy and how it saved the representatives from each state at that point from having to answer to the public prematurely, and how the lack of this need to answer to the public actually increased the efficiency of the meetings and the ability to legislate and create the Constitution. And so this same discussion about transparency, kind of weighing the pros and cons, exists with the presence of broadcasting and media in the judicial branch, specifically in the courtrooms. Some people believe that the presence of media in the courtroom would increase public involvement in education, while others believe that this increase in public involvement and education could lead to an impeded ability for the judicial branch to do their jobs. And that's an interesting point, because is it the job of the judicial branch to educate the public, or is it their job to interpret the law? Another kind of existing government institution where there's this argument over whether there should be an increased presence of media is the military, specifically when considering embedding journalists. Right now, or a few years back, about a decade ago, during the Iraq War, this idea of introducing embedded journalists to the military was introduced, and there are definite pros and cons to be weighed. Some of the good things is that the media is there firsthand to experience what's happening and report back to the public. Some of the negative things that comes with this is the idea that the military can control, or the government can control what is being produced and given to the public. Another idea that comes up during this is the idea of self-censorship, and how journalists, specifically the embedded journalists, have a difficulty expressing what they witness and observe and relaying it to the public. One embedded journalist, Gordon Dillow, wrote, "The discomforts and dangers of war were easily dealt with. Accurately conveying the reality of it to the readers back home was not." Furthermore, this idea of the role of the media is to spread information and increase transparency can also be kind of outweighed and negated by the ability of officials to promote a false sense of transparency, which is something that Brendan kind of spoke about earlier. And it's the idea of politicians using the media, like Trump recently has, to reshape public opinion and manipulate what the media shares with the public. And so it's this idea that the possibility of manipulation in the media, where even the information that is being given to the public is manufactured in a way to actually subvert transparency. And so finally, I'd like to touch upon a possible solution to this, where maybe increasing transparency shouldn't be the goal of the media, but rather increasing the breadth of diversity among journalists should be the goal. And so, increasing the voices that are being heard, the perspectives that are being told. And one of the ways to do this is by looking at the relationship between public and private media and increasing the organizations that the media is coming from.
Very good. All right, we're going to take a short break and come back with questions.
Is it wintertime and you're getting really chilly? Do you need to just walk around looking fashionable for everyone to see? If so, go get a Patagonia coat or vest today, and you will look better than you ever have.
And so we're back. Now we're gonna ask some questions. And Brendan,
I'll start out for you, Juliana. Do you think there are any limitations on the press that are evident in the U.S. political climate today?
Sure. I mean, definitely part of the First Amendment, although it ensures freedom of the press, this freedom isn't limitless. Um, you know, throughout laws that have been passed during the history of the nation, there's this idea of kind of national security first, which is definitely something that's good, but it can limit against hate speech and treasonous speech, especially during time of war. And also the idea of accessibility of the press itself. The media doesn't have a unique or special accessibility to important events or what are deemed newsworthy events. And so the accessibility of the press to actually get the information is often up to public officials and their want to kind of disperse press passes to the media.
So you talked about things such as national security, and that falls under the prior restraint aspect of the limitations that we've seen. So my question is, do you think prior restraint and censorship are reasonable forms of limitations?
So censorship is a tricky word, I think. And I think, there have been instances, especially you look at Edward Snowden, you look at the Pentagon Papers and things like that. There has to be a warranted and justified need for the censorship, and it has to be a reasonable threat to national security, because I think the public does have a right to be informed. However, everybody has their own opinion of what is a justifiable concern for national security. And so when this falls under jurisdiction of the government, there definitely leaves room for censorship to play a role, especially when the government is deciding what can be said about the national government and national security.
Well, I also have a question for you, and it's about the Pentagon Papers. And what do you think? Is it good for transparency, or do you think it really hurts the government?
Yep. So for those of you that don't know, the Pentagon Papers are basically refer to some information released by, I believe, the New York Times in around 1970, 1971. And it revealed some military secrets and such regarding, I believe, the Vietnam War. And after these were published on the front page of the Times, the Attorney General at the time spoke to the New York Times and asked them to remove the articles and stop publishing further military secrets. At that time, I believe initially the publication refused because they wanted, their goal obviously was to provide transparency and information to the public. And then afterwards, the government enforced a temporary court order to stop the Times from publishing related articles. I think in this case, if I remember correctly, the information that was being released was actually accessible at that point, and it had already been made accessible. So this was just a matter of increasing kind of the reach it had in the public. In that case, I think it's definitely a good thing and a necessary thing when the information was already available, just making it more easily accessed by the public.
It's very interesting stuff. I'd like to ask a question about something you touched on that I find very interesting, which is embedding journalists in the military. And I'd like to ask, you have studied this a lot more than I have personally, but do you think that this would be beneficial for transparency, and do you think those benefits would outweigh the possibility that perhaps our military would not be as effective or do their job as well?
Yeah, so for sure there are concerns about safety and the effect that it actually has on the military. Obviously, the military is now responsible for the safety of the journalists themselves and their presence within the unit. Hopefully, if this process were to be implemented fully and correctly, or at least how I believe it would correctly means, the journalists and the media personnel that are going to actually be embedded in the military will have the proper training and the necessary training that members of the military actually undergo. But in regards to kind of the effect that the embedded journalists have, there definitely is the ability for the government to kind of control the information that is going out, and the government in official like reports actually identify that there are benefits to them as well. They talk about how media coverage of military operations can help shape public perception in a good way. Public perception being from the American people and from other countries. And but I think ultimately any increase of information that is going to the public is a good thing, and then it becomes the duty of the public and the duty of the individual citizen to determine if the information they're receiving is valuable or not. And so, like I said, it kind of bubbles down to this idea of increasing the voices that are being heard and increasing meaningful voices and increasing diversity in the media landscape. So the public has a wider expanse of opinions and wider expanse of information to then make their own opinions about.
All right. Well, thank you for that. We're now going to take another break and finish up with our last topic for this episode.
Are you one of those people who are always going to get your phone fixed over and over again? Well, don't worry about that anymore with OtterBox phone cases. Come in now, buy one for $35 and get one free. Okay, and welcome back to the Stag podcast. I'm your co-host Dylan Hamer, and today we will be sending it over to Sam to talk to us about the fragile state of the media.
Yeah, thank you. So, we like to think about the United States as being a bastion of freedom. We have the Bill of Rights in it. We have the protection of our First Amendment, which is freedom of the press, and so on. But our country is going through a time where our beloved press is under threat. That's mainly from the president and also the declining trust of the public. Now, the president has the highest office in our land, has immense power and responsibility, and therefore he should be the role model in protecting our freedoms. But Mr. Trump, or President Trump, is not. He's doing the opposite. He's attacking our press, our First Amendment, by his endless aggressive attacks. And there's a plethora of examples of him doing this. More recently, he has come out against New York Times, saying it's being the enemy of the people, which he loves to say, fake news. And this is very dangerous. We have seen more violence against journalists than in more recent years, here and abroad. Here we have this congressman, what's his name, who out in Minnesota, Greg Gianforte, who body slammed a reporter. And instead of condemning it, Mr. Trump in 2018 went to a rally for the re-election of Gianforte, where he said that, quote, any guy that can do a body slam, he's my guy. Therefore encouraging such acts of violence to take place in the United States. Him being a role model of freedom too for the world doesn't really doesn't end well when he is continuously berating the press and journalists, therefore greenlighting countries that have terrible human rights records to go after their own press, because who's going to stop them? The leader of the bastion free world is berating his own. So this is why we're seeing people like the Khashoggi murders, who he was a writer for the Washington Post, and big critic of the Saudi government. And in 2018, he went to Turkey in Istanbul, where he went to the Saudi Arabian consulate, and he never came out. He was murdered. He was dismembered, and this was done by Saudi Arabian agents. And it found out, or the CIA found out that this is related to, or the heir to the crown. He was the one responsible for this. So we also find that Donald Trump's attacks against our press has created a trust issue with the American people and the press. And we can see this in polls where there's a divide in trust, and just 32 Americans trust the media, the lowest level recorded since Gallup began asking questions in 1972. And also, when it comes to Democrats and Republicans, 87% of Democrats as well as 42% of Republicans believe that the criticism by the media against elected officials keep them in check. Now, this is a 42-point percentage gap, and you can see that Republicans are kind of going with Donald Trump and say that they're evil, while the Democrats think, no, they should criticize him. They're right. And it's a big problem. There are people that are trying to invest in some type of rebuilding of faith with the public, as in groups, investment firm Amidar Network. They threw in $100 billion to help increase trust, and we see that some people are seeing it and they're taking action. We're gonna go and take another break and come back with questions.
If you've ever been doing work while you're wicked tired, or you ever needed a hot drink in the morning, think no longer. Go to Dunkin' Donuts and you will get a great coffee today.
Okay, so really interesting stuff from Sam right there. I know we all have questions. I'll start us off. My question has to do with President Trump. Obviously, you talked a lot about his actions. My question is, what do you think he could do differently in the future? Let's say if he is reelected in 2020, to make his relationship with the media possibly a little better, or just to not be as critical of the media?
So Donald Trump is trying to control the narrative, which he sees he has problems of controlling because he is going after media so aggressively. But there are ways in which Donald Trump can win over the narrative and yet protect or cherish freedom of the press. And the first way he could try and win favor with the media, I don't know if it's going to be successful because of his history or past history, but he can bolster an individual journalist's career if he just helps him get material to write stories, become a little transparent, and if journalists say are not in line of his beliefs or what the narrative should be, he can try to restrict the freedoms or privileges that he gives them. And it's like minor things like interviews or accommodations on Air Force One, giving answers to questions. These vital things are important for journalists. And them, taking it away or threatening to take it away would therefore prompt them to be more in line of what Donald Trump wants for a narrative. And again, this is you're threatening them, but not like verbally or physically threatening them. Like, uh,
So, I mean, there certainly are a bunch of things that President Trump can do to help kind of rebuild the relationship with the media. But what do you think journalists can do to help rebuild that trust?
So yeah, it's now important for journalists to understand that the media is it's in a fragile state. They too need to act to counteract the threats. With trust too, since that has gone down, they have to rebuild it. It's important for them to educate the people of their practices when it comes to, say, anonymous sources and how it's a problem that people have because they don't trust in sources that are anonymous, and the president has pointed it out. But if they have some sort of reading material for readers to look at so they understand, they have a better idea of why certain things happen or are included. Also, too, it's also important for journalists to go to schools to teach the kids so they grow up having better trust in the media.
So the media kind of has to play or work on two relationships, not only with the government, but with the people.
Yeah.
So there definitely has to be a focus on that.
Because, they're the main readers, the people. And if the people go away, so will our press. And that's going to be very negative in our future. Tyrannical regimes, no one's correcting them.
All right, I got one last question for you, Sam. How do you think the future relationships between the media and presidents will be post the Trump presidency?
Well, what we have saw since 2015 is such a horrendous attack against the press, which then has prompted many other politicians to go after the media, whether it's to pander to their base or whatever. It's gone to the point where it's very concerning that this will be the new trend. We have to see, because Donald Trump isn't out of office yet. But it seems like it's going to be a while before politicians really hold back on their threats against the media. Around the world, it's up in the air because now Donald Trump set the standard to attack the media. Authoritarians are probably going to go ham while Donald Trump's in office. Whether there's going to be another president that will stand up for the press and try to end such horrible things like the killings of journalists, we don't know. Hopefully they do, but at the end of the day, we have to see if the people are going to elect someone that will uphold their freedoms.
Do you think in future presidencies that there will be, or the media will have to take accountability for some actions on their end, or do you think that this exists solely within the president's
So I believe that the media should point out their flaws, but yet correct them. You know what I mean? It's just to regain that losing trust, that losing faith. And that's why it's also important to have for journalists, for companies to hire more public editors, so that their pieces, how they run things, journalistic standards is checked. So
all right, that's good stuff.
So we're gonna end the podcast here. I'm Sam.
I'm Brendan.
Dylan Hamer.
And Juliana.
All right. Well, have a good one, everyone, and we'll see you next time on the Stag.